Thank you for joining. We'll go ahead and get started. Again, my name is Dan Abbey. I'm the Forest Service representative at the Carhart National Wilderness Training Center. It's a pleasure for me to introduce to you Dr. Michelle Reilly. She is my coworker at the Arthur Carhart National Wilderness Training Center, and she is the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service representative there. And she's had an opportunity to provide this content for us. She's rolling it out. I'm pretty excited to see it. I hope everybody enjoys it. And with that, Michelle, if there's anything you want to add, you can take it from here.
Okay, thank you, Dan. No, I just was saying if anyone has questions and you feel like they need to be answered right away, feel free to unmute yourself and interrupt me. I don't mind if you do that. So, okay, everyone, welcome to this alternative wilderness history session. Thank you for joining. I'd also like to thank Dan Abbey for moderating and hosting this, and also to NWSI for giving me this opportunity to talk to everyone. So I'm going to start with the women in our wilderness history. And I'd like to also thank Ann Schwaller. She's a Forest Service employee that I had the pleasure of working with a few years ago. And she really inspired a lot of this research that I put into and this Women in Wilderness presentation and the article that I wrote. So the content for this first session, or part of the session that I'm discussing, is from an article that I wrote for the spring 2021 issue of the International Journal of Wilderness. And at the end of the presentation, or Dan can do it, we'll put the link to that article in the chat box if anyone's interested. And then after I go through the Women in Wilderness presentation, I'm going to spend the latter half of this session going through a history of the drafting of the Wilderness Bill and the subsequent Wilderness Act. And I'm going to note three main criticisms of the Wilderness Act. And then I'm going to present some historical documents that show that these criticisms are misguided. And then I'm going to suggest a way to move forward. Okay, so with that, let's go ahead and get started. Wilderness is an amazing gift. I don't think I have to convince anyone on this session that it is a gift, and it provides us with innumerable benefits. I can't thank our wilderness predecessors enough for their foresight and their commitment to protection of our natural lands. And the wilderness story has been told many times, so we all know the key figures. And we've heard stories told and retold about these big three, the wilderness heroes credited time and time again. So on the left, Howard Zonnheiser, who was the executive president of the Wilderness Society and is the primary author of the Wilderness Act. On the top right, Bob Marshall, also a Forest Service employee and co-founder and financier of the Wilderness Society. And then Aldo Leopold, author and another Forest Service employee, also co-founder of the Wilderness Society. But the story shouldn't be all about just men, because the stories are much more diverse. And I'm here today to either remind you of those stories or maybe to introduce you to a few of those stories. This collage is in the journal article, and it has the names and the credits at the end of the article if you're interested in seeing who any of these women are. So this is the credits at the end of the article with the names. And again, you can look these people up and do a bit of your own research if you'd like. Okay, so here we are in present day, and I'll invite you to think of a future where perhaps Ruth Bader Ginsburg isn't mentioned for her contribution to gender discrimination, or without mention of Greta Thunberg when hearing about environmental activism. And our wilderness history is rich with female contributors and contributions, which should be acknowledged just as regularly as those stories with the male counterparts. And in 1961, President John F. Kennedy, he established the Commission on the Status of Women, and he appointed Eleanor Roosevelt as chairwoman. And I'm going to play a short audio clip. There's no video to this particular clip. The clip, we'll listen to it. It's only a minute and a half long. It's very short. And it's from a televised 1962 discussion between Roosevelt and Kennedy. So Dan or someone, if it's not coming through clear, just unmute yourself and let me know. Okay, so let me see if I can get this started for us.
Mrs. Eleanor Roosevelt's interview with the president on the status of women, April 18, 1962.
Mr. President, I would like to thank you for being on this program. Thank you, Mr. President. Now, I would like to ask you, because I have always been interested in women's affairs, and I was very much honored when you made me chairman of your new committee on the status of women. Perhaps you'd be willing to tell the people what prompted you to name this committee at this time and what you feel is the real need for it.
Well, we are attempting to make sure that the women, for example, who work, 1/3 of our working force are women. We want to try to encourage every company in the United States and certainly stimulate governmental leadership in providing equal pay and equal conditions for women. 22 states do it now. We can do a much better job on that. We want to make sure that the available talent which we have in this country in trained women is being used effectively. I think we want to make sure that some recognition is given to the special problems women have as the mother and the housewife, and at the same time their desires to participate usefully in public and private life. This is a matter of great national concern, and I think that in this great society of ours, we want to be sure that women are used as effectively as they can to provide a better life for our people, in addition to meeting their primary responsibility, which is in the home.
Mrs. Eleanor.
Okay, so I just wanted to see if everyone caught that last statement. He said, we want to be sure that women are used as effectively as they can, in addition to meeting their primary responsibility, which is in the home. And I'm not highlighting this as a way to shame anyone. Times were different, norms were different, and I recognize that. I just wanted to share to provide some context for the stories I'm going to tell today. It's not about shaming or blaming anyone. It's just more information and more context. So if you want, you can use the annotation tool. It's on your taskbar at the top. It's like a little pencil, and you can write or draw on this screen and just say what your thoughts or feelings are upon hearing this. And again, as we go through this, times were different. Times are different now. And cultural norms have changed over the past decades. I want to illustrate how culture may have relegated women to these roles in this time period in history. And so what common attitudes were held in the recent past, what they are, and then move forward from that position. So everyone's feeling a little sleepy. No, it's not Monday. Well, anyway, it's midday. Everyone has lunch belly. So we're going to move on. I'm not going to make people write on the screen if they don't want to. So before I get into the women that I wanted to talk about today, I wanted to share this little piece of history. This is a document dated April 4th, 1936. And it's a note from the first meeting of the Washington section of the Wilderness Society. And you can see a list of names. It says they're members, and it has a list of names of people who were in attendance. And of those 17 members in attendance of this first meeting, 9 here that are listed are females. Okay, so thinking about that clip with Kennedy, that being the prevalent viewpoint at the time, it's no wonder that the important work and the stories about females are not as well known or recognized in our wilderness history. So perhaps the contributions of those women were easy to lose record of because these women weren't seen as typical participants in these rules. So let's learn some of those stories now. So we're going to start with the most well-known woman I'll talk about today, and that is Marty Murray. She's often referred to as the matriarch of the wilderness movement or the grandmother of the conservation movement. And Marty was a field biologist. She was a teacher, and she was an author. And in her book, Two in the Far North, originally published in 1962, she advocated for wilderness protection in Alaska. And this picture here on the cover of the book is Marty and her husband, and it was taken after they returned from their honeymoon in Alaska. So in 1956, Marty Olaus and some other field biologists, they traveled to the Upper Sinjac River on the south slope of the Brooks Range, inside what is now the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. And their mission was to garner support and to gain protection for an entire ecological system as the Arctic National Wildlife Range. So let me say that again, an entire ecological system. This was not common approach to conservation at this time, and it's really impressive thinking. And so they recruited former US Supreme Court Justice William O. Douglas to help persuade the president, who was Eisenhower, to consider their campaign. And President Eisenhower established the range in 1960 and set aside more than 8 million acres for the, quote, unique wildlife, wilderness, and recreational values. And her devotion to wilderness is apparent in her testimony to Congress in 1977 for the Alaska Lands Act. And she wrote, "I'm testifying as an emotional woman, and I would like to ask you, gentlemen, what's wrong with emotion? Beauty is a resource in and of itself. Alaska must be allowed to be Alaska. That is her greatest economy. I hope that the United States of America is not so rich that she can afford to let these wildernesses pass by, or so poor she cannot afford to keep them." And I added this in here. I just had to, because when I was going through historical documents, I love looking at historical documents, and I saw this, and it sort of cracked me up. The title is Woman of Wilderness Has Liking for Wolves. And it says in the first paragraph, they say that Marty believes preservation of wilderness areas is of major importance. And then, of course, I can't laugh at the one subheading that says babies went along, talking about her children that went along. So I thought that was amusing. Oh, getting a little bit of a delay there. Oh, babies went along. There you go. Okay. After her husband Olaus's death in 1963, Marty continued to fight for wilderness preservation, writing letters and articles and speaking at hearings. She was very active, and she pushed for the Alaska National Interest Conservation Lands Act, which passed in 1980, giving protection to 104 million acres as various conservation lands. And that also included increasing the size of the refuge by 10 million acres. Marty's contribution to conservation and preservation in Alaska helped protect some large tracts of wilderness in the country. And Marty was awarded the Audubon Medal, one of the highest honors in conservation, in 1980. And she received the Sierra Club John Muir Award in 1983. And in 1998, President Clinton awarded Marty the Presidential Medal of Freedom, which is the highest civilian award. She worked for more than 70 years to protect wild spaces. And in October of 2003, Marty died in her cabin in Moose, Wyoming at the age of 101. And upon her death, the Los Angeles Times wrote an article, and a staff writer wrote, "Marty Murray served as her husband's secretary, hostess, and cook, as well as forthright adjunct in her preservation activities." And with a life as grand as hers, with the contributions to wilderness and to the United States, I hope that Marty is remembered as an inspirational leader and for her dedication to wilderness and conservation, and not as her husband's secretary, hostess, or cook. Okay, next we're going to move on to Jenny Hill Wood and Celia Hunter. And if you live in Alaska or if you've worked in Alaska, these two women are probably known to you. Jenny Hill Wood and Celia Hunter were lifetime friends, lifetime adventure partners, and wilderness heroes. They both served in World War II as women air service pilots, also known as WASPs for short. And after the WASPs were dismantled, they continued to fly on commercial airlines or as pilots for the fledgling tourism industry. When they were in Alaska, they decided they didn't want to work for any large-scale tourism groups. So inspired by the hut systems they saw in Europe as they biked across Europe and when they were younger, they looked for a wilderness setting where they could offer simple accommodations with outdoor activities that encouraged appreciation of the natural world. And in 1952, they filed a Homestead Act claim for property near Denali National Park with a view of the peak. And Jenny and Celia and Jenny's husband opened the first ecotourism operation in Alaska and called it Camp Denali. And this experience offered guests the opportunity to, quote, live for a while in the midst of primeval grandeur. And living and working at Camp Denali really deepened their respect and admiration for Alaska's wildlands. In 1960, they started a grassroots campaign to strengthen support for the creation of the Arctic Wildlife Refuge, which at the time Senator Bob Bartlett was building opposition for. So they set out to recruit Alaskans in support of the refuge and to get people to testify at the hearings. And here's Jenny's testimony, and it really shows her wilderness values. It says, the wilderness that we have conquered and squandered in our conquest of new lands has produced the traditions of the pioneer that we want to think still prevail. Freedom, opportunity, adventure, and resourceful, rugged individuals. These qualities can still be nurtured in generations of the future if we are farsighted and wise enough to set aside this wild country immediately and spare it from the exploitations of the few for the lasting benefit of the many. So Jenny and Celia, they were successful. Most of the testimonies were in support of the Arctic Wildlife Refuge. In the early 1970s, Celia became increasingly active in grassroots efforts to pass what would later become the Alaska National Interest Lands Conservation Act. Both women were strong supporters, and they were also heavily relied on for their extensive knowledge of issues in Alaska. In 1976, Celia became the first woman executive director of the Wilderness Society and the first for any national environmental organization. And her role as a female executive director was not uncontroversial, and she was met with some disapproval. Susan Morgan, a co-worker at the Wilderness Society at the time, said that when Celia started as director, she had to deal with some people who didn't like having a strong woman as a leader. And she characterized Celia's leadership as an quote, unforgettable lesson in the power of grace, humility, and humor in response to bias and criticism. Celia and Jenny inspired people through their activisms, through their writings, and through their daily life. And in 1991, they were awarded the Sierra Club's John Muir Award. And in 2001, the Alaska Conservation Foundation awarded them the Lifetime Achievement Award. And former Governor Jay Hammond called Celia and Ginny the great dames of the environmental movement. Celia and Ginny never lost their enthusiasm for wilderness and conservation. Okay, next is an amazing story about Polly Dyer, and she's here in the far right of the screen. And Polly's story is an unfortunate example of how inaccurate historical narratives can undermine the contribution of women throughout history. And I'm not suggesting that the inaccurate narratives were intentionally repeated in some devious manner, just that sometimes the full story isn't known. And then over time, what is known becomes the story. So it's important to tell historical stories accurately. In 1968, President Johnson created North Cascades National Park, and this was Washington's third national park. And central to this long campaign for North Cascades was Polly Dyer. In the mid-1950s, Polly met Howard Zonnheiser, again, executive secretary of the Wilderness Society at the time, when they both fought to stop construction of the Echo Park Dam in Dinosaur National Monument. And years later, during a visit to Polly's home in Seattle, Howard heard her use the word untrammeled in her campaign to protect stretches of coastline near Olympic National Park. And I'm not going to say she recommended the word in this draft, but it was, that I've heard most stories, and I'm not here to right now argue either one. But I do want to say that regardless of whether she asked him or recommended it to him, it was her enthusiastic use of the word that inspired and swayed Howard to adopt this word as the primary descriptor of wilderness. Okay, I don't usually like doing this, but I'm going to backtrack a little bit. In 1958, Polly organized a hike to protest a proposed road on Ocean Strip of Olympic National Park. And the hike drew some very notable figures of the time. I've already mentioned Justice William O. Douglas. Also in attendance on this hike was Howard Zonnheiser, another Wilderness Society co-founder, Harvey Broom, Sigurd Olson, Marty Murray, among others. And the hike lasted 3 days, covered more than 20 miles, and it is quoted as being a key moment in the environmental movement in the Northwest. And so I'm just going to play, if I can, I'm just going to play a very short clip for you. Let's see if this works. So that's Polly in green right there.
This was a hike to remember. You might say our whole nation was involved, for something was at stake that concerns you and me and our children, and the children of our children. You might say, too, that it began in our nation's capital, because the idea for such a hike started with William O. Douglas of the United States Supreme Court. This is Justice Douglas coming down the steps of...
Okay, so you can watch that on YouTube if you want to watch more of it. It's a really interesting I don't know, old movie that's been edited and colorized and everything like that. So the list of accomplishments and awards attributed to Polly is extensive. When asked what distinguished her from other environmentalists, Peter Jackson of the North Cascades Institute answered, humility. She had grace and presence. She was perfectly happy to let others take credit. And when I was researching Polly for this article, I wondered if the lack of credit for the word untrammeled could also be attributed to the humility that people knew her for. Okay, next is Helen Fenske, and she's described as the housewife who lived at the edge of the swamp. But she played a prominent role in galvanizing citizen support for and she became an early leader for what became the Great Swamp Campaign. So in 1959, the Port Authority of New Jersey and New York announced a plan to fill in the Great Swamp in New Jersey and to develop a new multi-million-dollar airport that was slated to be, quote, the world's largest international jetport. The Great Swamp Basin is home to 39 species of mammals. It's a nesting site for 244 species of birds. And the Great Swamp Committee used this data to formulate a proposal that the area be designated as a national wildlife refuge. And this was their attempt to stop the jetport proposal. On his second visit to a regional office, the first being unsuccessful, Helen secured a promise from the regional director of Fish and Wildlife Service that if the Great Swamp Committee could purchase 3,000 acres, that he would open a Fish and Wildlife Service office there and assign a manager. But purchasing thousands of acres was not easy. The area had hundreds of woodlots dating back to the 1700s, for which they needed the guaranteed titles for before Fish and Wildlife Service would proceed. So with the help of some local elites and a lot of determination and networking on Helen's part, the committee raised $5 million to purchase the titles to 2,600 acres of land. And then on May 29th, 1964, the Secretary of the Interior oversaw the dedication of the refuge. But the Port Authority had not lost interest in their plans. They had some new plans. And so at this point in time, Helen was at her home and she was reading the words of the Wilderness Act in a newspaper article. And she knew that wilderness designation was the only way to permanently save Great Swamp. So she led a successful campaign, and the Great Swamp National Wildlife Refuge Wilderness was one of the last pieces of legislation that President Johnson signed before leaving office. And Abigail Fair of the Association of New Jersey Environmental Commission said about Helen, people have got to tip their hats to her for saving this area. Without her energy and her intelligence, I think we would be the fourth metropolitan jetport. And then fellow activist Dave Moore of the New Jersey Conservation Foundation said, no one had taken on the Port Authority, and certainly no one had taken them on and won. But Helen did. And when asked about her work for the Great Swamp, she stated there were a lot of people who contributed to the campaign. And she also said, our story is not remarkable nor unusual at all. So again, another story with an incredible amount of humility. Okay, so the final featured woman for this webinar today is Sarah James. And on the coastal plains of the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, there is a place referred to as the sacred place where all life begins by the Gwich'in of Alaska. The Gwich'in live south of the Brooks Range, strategically located along the porcupine caribou herds migration path. And the coastal plains serve as a birthing ground and a nursery ground for the herd and are deeply intertwined with the Gwich'in way of life. So legislation to protect Arctic refuge, coastal plains as wilderness has been introduced in nearly every Congress starting in 1986. The coastal plains is described as, quote, the most biologically productive part of the Arctic refuge for wildlife and is the center of wildlife activity. So Sarah James is native Nitsya Gwich'in and has championed protection of the coastal plains for decades. In 1988, the Gwich'in leaders from across Alaska and Canada developed a resolution to formalize their opposition to energy development in the refuge and their support for wilderness designation of the coastal plains. And so Sarah was asked to serve as one of the 8 representatives that would take this to the political arena. So she's traveled nationally and internationally to give speeches and testimonies about the importance of the porcupine caribou herd. In 2002, Sarah was awarded the Goldman Environmental Prize for her grassroots environmental activism with a Gwich'in. And in 2015, the Wilderness Society awarded Sarah their Robert Marshall Award, again, their highest honor for her conservation and land ethic work. And the Ford Foundation, awarded Sarah a fellowship as one of their emerging leaders in a changing world. In September of 2020, with the help of the Native American Rights Fund, 2 Alaska tribes, including Sarah's, filed a lawsuit in the federal district court against Interior Secretary Bernhardt and the Trump administration to protect the coastal plains of the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge from oil and gas development. This is one of several suits that was brought against the government because of the large-scale oil and gas development across the coastal plains and the fact that it may have significant impact on the communities, the indigenous communities living there. So after 50 years of advocacy, Sarah continues to speak for the caribou, the refuge, and for wilderness using positive messaging and compassion. And Sarah has been leading the campaign against exploration in the sacred place where life begins. And thanks to her, these issues have gained national attention, and she continues to campaign and support wilderness designation. So these are just a few stories that emphasize the contribution of women environmentalists and conservationists to our wilderness history. There are others, but what I wanted to leave you with is these stories and this knowledge, and the fact that these talented and passionate pioneers have these stories, and these stories should be told so that they do continue to inspire other women who fight for wilderness. Uh-oh. As I said, next I'm going to present a few historical documents to help provide some context to the drafting of the wilderness bills, as well as the act itself. And I'm also going to incorporate some past research from various publications on this topic. So I encourage you to listen. I encourage you to use the information to make your own choices. I'm going to advocate for a forward-looking interpretation of wilderness, a positive interpretation that helps us move forward, instead of a backward-looking criticism that causes unnecessary and unhealthy strife and angst. So instead of building bridges that can connect us, backward-looking alternative interpretations of the Wilderness Act, in my opinion, unnecessarily divides us. And so I am going to just go for it right now. And again, comment as you have comments, and Dan can let me know if I need to stop. Okay, so we already have these facts, but the Wilderness Act signed into law by President Johnson on September 3rd, 1964, with bipartisan support. But the Wilderness Act wasn't without struggle. It required many hearings and redraftings and compromises. And this is common. It's how laws get made. There are diverse groups with diverse interests, and redrafting and drafting is part of the process. Recall this slide earlier, document from 1936, and of the 17 members in attendance, at least 9 are women. And this is not, shouldn't be something that looks foreign to anyone. This is the definition of wilderness from the Wilderness Act. And instead of reading the definition and picking out particular words, pulling them out of context, and trying to interpret them negatively, I'm going to invite you to look at the definition within its historical context and with the accompanying historical documentation, and again, to develop a forward-looking interpretation. The objective of this presentation is to provide these historical tools to you so that you're able to use them in your future work in wilderness and your journey through wilderness, and making wilderness a place for all people as it was intended to be. I'm not sure if anyone's seen this quote before. It was supposedly said by an agency man during the Nixon trials. It can also be traced to an earlier ad agency and some marketing research, but the history of the saying isn't what's really important right now. I'm putting this up as a reminder to be open-minded, to not be like the agency man, conscious choice to avoid objective analyses of situations isn't helpful in moving us forward. So with that, let's dive in with an open mind and a historical looking glass. Okay, so the idea of wilderness has been the subject of ongoing academic and popular debate. There has been criticism for decades about the act being dualistic, ethnocentric, and static. One critic states that the definition of wilderness offered by the Wilderness Act assumes, quote, assumes, indeed it enshrines a bifurcation of man and nature. And this ongoing conversation, it has helped advocates, it has helped philosophers and historians alike to think more clearly about the historical and contemporary meaning of wilderness. It's worth noting that the thoughts and beliefs attributed to the criticism of the Wilderness Act authors and the criticism of the idea of wilderness does not seem to be reflected in the intentions of the Wilderness Act authors. It does not seem to be reflected in subsequent congressional actions or federal management practices. So again, I'll mention this debate has surfaced numerous times over the years and over the decades. And the reason it doesn't gain traction is that, as I'll show you over the next few slides, the critiques are negated by the facts found in historical documentation. And so with that, let's start looking at these. Okay, so we're going to go over some Supreme Court stuff. And I'm putting this question to you. Do these statements in the Wilderness Act mean that the framers intended to limit wilderness for the male population, or that such a framing is one possible alternative? So what do we see here? Untrammeled by man. Man himself is a visitor who does not remain, with the imprint of man's work substantially unnoticeable. So no, so we can't just take out these things and, pull them out of their hole and interpret them in any which way we want. And I'll read this quote from the Supreme Court case here. It is, of course, true that statutory construction, quote, is a holistic endeavor, and that the meaning of a provision is clarified by the remainder of the statutory scheme. So let's look at the rest of the statutory scheme. What else does the Wilderness Act say? The complete title of the Wilderness Act is an act to establish a national wilderness preservation system for the permanent good of the whole people and for other purposes. In Section 2A of the Act, it is hereby declared to be the policy of the Congress to secure for the American people of present and future generations. Further, in Section 2A, shall be administered for the use and enjoyment of the American people. Okay, so we see that in the Act, sometimes man is used, sometimes people is used. And so we can't just choose those parts where it says man. We have to look at the entire language of the law. But we don't need to stop there. We're going to look further. How has the word man been used over time? And more importantly, how is it being used during the drafting of the Wilderness Act? Okay, so I said we're going to look at the Wilderness Act through a historical lens. We're going to look at it in its entirety. Could you get offended that it says man instead of human? Could you read into that as deliberately offensive? You could, I hope not, because what we just saw was that man was used, public was used, people were used, Americans were used. But let's look at how the word was used historically. So mankind, we see here, it is used collectively, and then further in the definition, it says otherwise preserving the original gender neutrality of man. And then again, here at the bottom, it was used generically for human race. Okay, so just more information that we're going to put in our pocket. What does the historical record of the time show about intent? So what you're seeing here is a testimony from Miss Ellen Brooker during a 1957 hearing before the U.S. Senate Committee on Interior and Insular Affairs. Again, it was 1957. And in her testimony, Miss Ellen Brooker quotes Howard Zonheiser from a publication called The Living Wilderness. And I'm going to read what that quote says. It states, it is not for the sake of any privileged few that we are thus working so strenuously for wilderness preservation, but rather for all Americans. But this quote, by Howard, it actually continues, and further down in it, he states, there is no person that we should like to exclude. There is no person we should like to exclude. Okay, so why is he saying there's no person we should like to exclude? Let me tell you why. It's because there was concern that these very beautiful natural places would soon only be available to a privileged few. This is I would say, famous, maybe to some, semi-famous to others. It was a memo written by Arthur Carhart in 1919 to Aldo Leopold. They were both Forest Service employees at the time. And as envisioned by Carhart and Leopold and Bob Marshall, wilderness in the United States was devoted to several key principles. And one of those was that these areas should provide public access to federal lands for people of a variety of means, stripping away privileges of class, land ownership, and motorized transportation. So beginning in 1915, the Term Permit Act followed The Term Permit Act allowed the Forest Service to grant 30-year leases for recreational developments such as lodges and Forest Service camps and summer homes. And Arthur Carhart feared that public access would be strangled by the term permit developments that were slated to possibly rim the lakeshore of Trappers Lake. And so Carhart considered this an inappropriate exclusion of simple public access in favor of a privileged few. And here you can see that he was opposed to the privatization of all areas. He believed that these areas, these scenic areas, were the right of all people and not just a privileged few. And there's definitely no suggestion about wilderness only being a place for man. That wasn't the focus. Wilderness was for all people. And it says on the screen, the quote that's highlighted, "There are scenic values and recreational areas of unusual beauty serving a great public need, which were never intended for private holdings." And then further down, he continues, which had passed from under the control of the general public and were held by individuals. Again, he's talking about those term permits and the lakeshore at Trappers Lake. And these are more quotes from that same letter. Carhart writes, the beauties of which a right should be the property of all people. And then again, further down, rightfully, always the property of the entire public. Okay, so I mentioned that letter was a correspondence between Carhart and Leopold. And Leopold was no doubt influenced by privileged conservationists such as Teddy Roosevelt and Gifford Pinchot, but many of his writings indicate that he had very different social priorities and notions of class. Leopold's wilderness vision viewed roads and automobiles as particularly disruptive socially and economically, but also expressed concern about the increasing trend toward outdoor experiences being available only for an elite few. And one article that he published said, but the expense of such trips puts them out of the question for the citizen of moderate means, and he is the man I'm talking about. I am trying to make it clear that a wilderness hunting trip is by way of becoming a rich man's privilege, whereas it has always been a poor man's right. So again, the idea of wilderness wasn't about limiting access for just men. It was a response to what was happening in our culture at this point in time. All right, I'm putting back up this Ellen Brooker testimony from 1957 because I just think she is full of quotable points. So I also like this because she discredits another wilderness myth, namely, again, that the wilderness is only for male participants and excludes those with less physical ability. So Miss Brooker states, whoever started that silly phrase that a wilderness is only for the hardy few hasn't been out in our mountains in the last few years. So I do believe Miss Brooker would disagree with the statement that wilderness is only for men. She calls it silly. And I see no connection thus far in these statements of any idea of wilderness being a male, able-bodied, white, middle-aged, purist view of wilderness. So right now we're going to move on off the word man. We're not going to go too far, though. I swear we'll pick up pace here in a little bit, but I want to get through this. Let's look at the last part of this same sentence because people attempt to interpret it in a divisive manner. And it might seem to suggest here, if you read this, that man is separate from nature, that there is a dichotomy between humans and nature, but that was not what the authors of the act were suggesting. So again, let's look at some drafts, some earlier drafts. I already said I love looking at historical documents and reading drafts of the Wilderness Act. So here is another screenshot from a 1957 draft of the Wilderness Bill. So there has been criticism that the Wilderness Act excludes humans, that it's targeted as a place where man is just visiting, that it decouples man and nature, and that the word untrammeled eclipses human presence. That's the criticism. But read what's written in this earlier draft of the Wilderness Act. So here is our definition of wilderness: untrammeled by man, where man himself is a member of the natural community, a wanderer who visits but does not remain, and whose travels leave only trails. And I think it's fantastic. It's fantastic. Man isn't separate from nature. He's part of the natural community. And I think it's a very powerful view that sheds a lot of light on the intentions in this section of the definition. As a form of U.S. public land, wilderness does not exclude people. It simply prescribes to some degree how people should act within its boundaries. Okay, so what else can we find about the intentions behind the wilderness idea? What do others think at this point in time? So I'm going to show two quotes from Sigurd Olsen from a publication called The Wilderness Concept, and this was written in 1956. In this publication, Olsen quotes G.M. Traveling, who said, quote, "We are literally children of the earth, and removed from her, our spirit withers and runs to various forms of insanity." And then he goes on to state, because wilderness means different things to people. When the final summary of values is made, the answer will no doubt be a combination of them all. So both of these quotes from Olsen suggest man as very much a part of nature, and further it suggests that the wilderness was open to all people, and they were already aware that it held different values for different people, and the combination of the values was what was going to make wilderness important to all these people. What we have to remember is that there were 66 drafts of the bill and hundreds of people providing input, suggesting edits, negotiating compromises, and shortening text. So the history is important, and what we have in the bill isn't wrong. It's a product of the times and of the bill writing process. But look how these slight differences, these differences are so slight, but how much of an impact they have. The first is our definition as we currently have it, where earth and its community of life are untrammeled by man, where man himself is a visitor who does not remain. Earlier version in 1957 draft, untrammeled by man, where man himself is a member of the natural community. The intention seems different, and that's why it's important to look at all of these historical drafts. This is a screenshot again from 1957 or 1958 testimony by Howard Zonheiser. And let me read the highlighted section. He states, "It is also characteristic of wilderness to impress its visitors with their relationship to other forms of life, and to afford those who linger an intimation of the interdependence of all life." And then further on, again, he states, "as to impress its visitors with their relationship to other forms of life." So reading these earlier drafts that said man is a part of the natural community, along with this, the testimony by Howard Zonheiser, who states twice of the importance of the relationship between man and nature and the interdependence of all life, I cannot read this and think that the intentions of the authors were to set man apart or above nature. It does not leave me with the suggestion that humans were in wilderness out to control, to conquer it through challenge. And I don't see a dichotomy. I don't see a man versus nature intention in these writings. The intentions aren't known perfectly. We can only research and interpret the paper trail, the interviews, and the recordings that were left behind. But what I'd say is that there is substantial evidence that the intention was not that there was a dichotomy between man and nature. Okay, we're going to now just review quickly this word untrammeled. There's been criticism that untrammeled wilderness refers only to pristine nature. Critics have read into the word untrammeled and conflated it with pristine and pure, which are two words that are never used in the Act. So why? Why does this interpretation keep coming up time and time again? Let's go ahead and let's look at some history. Prior to the statutory restrictions written into the Wilderness Act, the Forest Service generally allowed some form of development, logging, grazing, or building roads for their own use within the boundaries of their administrative wilderness. So the proposed definition of wilderness in the Wilderness Bill was much stricter, and it was not overly well received by industries or the USDA. So it's really important to note that it was parties opposed to expanding the wilderness system, not wilderness advocates, who really embraced the dualism inherent in this purity definition. The timber industry and others invoked this notion of pristine wilderness to prevent commercially valuable lands from being included in the National Wilderness Preservation System. So at one point, the Forest Service argued that according to the Wilderness Act, lands previously impacted by humans in any way could no longer be considered as candidates for wilderness designation. And defining wilderness in this way became known as the purity definition of wilderness. And if anyone has more questions about this, definitely reach out to me and I can help you the best I can. But you can also do some further research on the early 70s roadless area review and evaluation process in which the Forest Service used the strict purity interpretation. And the findings of that process, when it was concluded, the findings were rejected by the public, by Congress, and by the Carter administration. And they had to redo the entire process using the non-purity interpretation of the definition of wilderness as found in Section 2C of the Wilderness Act. And the result was inclusion of many more areas of potential wilderness. Under the purity definition, 274 areas were identified as potential wilderness containing about 12 million acres. After redoing the process using the definition of wilderness in Section 2C of the Act, almost 3,000 areas containing over 62 million acres were identified. So quite a different result after redoing that and using the definition of wilderness in the Wilderness Act. Another example of Congress and the public rejecting the purity definition of untrammeled wilderness is the passing of the Eastern Wilderness Act. So the Eastern Wilderness Act, Areas Act, was signed into law by President Gerald Ford in 1975. And the act designated 16 new wilderness areas in the eastern United States, including 207,000 acres of wilderness on national lands in 13 states. Eastern areas were smaller and showed signs of significant human impact. But again, this law passed, and it is another example of Congress demonstrating that untrammeled wilderness did not mean unused, untouched, or unaltered by human hands. This shows that the purity definition of wilderness is unfounded. I think a lot of people will recognize the taller man in this photo. This is Bob Marshall. He was the U.S. Forest Service official responsible for writing the first wilderness regulations for the Forest Service. He was a socialist. and a persistent advocate for social justice. And in those early days, before the Wilderness Act, Bob Marshall defined wilderness, and he specifically recognized that, quote, trails and temporary shelters, which were common long before the advent of white race, are entirely permissible. So the authors of the act and early wilderness advocates were not interested. They were not interested in pristine wilderness. They were interested in protecting against modern environmental threats and privatization of lands. Pure and pristine are not words that are used in the act, and I caution those who attempt to interpret the intentions of the authors in that way. It isn't just the authors who didn't intend wilderness to be unused. It has been exemplified in subsequent wilderness designations. It has been exemplified by the public and by our wilderness managers. Now we're going to move on to the last criticism. So critics of the wilderness idea emphasize that our understanding of wilderness is uniquely European American cultural artifact. The myth of North America as pristine wilderness prior to European settlement renders the original inhabitants of the continent invisible, and it conveniently whitewashes the tragic history of their persecution at the hands of European American settlers. And so the fact that the continent was already inhabited by millions of Native Americans presented a serious problem for both the myth of manifest destiny and also the myth of pristine wilderness. And the results have been the same for Native people: dispossession, dislocation, and suffering. But I want to pause a minute and separate this out. I want to look at a timeline and just get all of our facts straight. So let's look more closely. Colonialism and wilderness. So critiques of wilderness may include quotes from the 1800s that state the frontier was, quote, uninhabited wilderness. And this should give you pause in this ongoing wilderness debate. Obviously, the notion of wilderness in the 1800s is not the same as designated wilderness today. Some of the national parks are built on land that was first forcibly emptied of the people who called it home. The history of Yellowstone National Park in 1872, Yosemite in 1890, and Glacier National Park in 1910 involve very negative and consequential actions on the indigenous people, undoubtedly. But the tendency to lump together the national parks and designated wilderness areas makes it too easy to overlook important historical and philosophical differences between the two. While many areas protected today as federal wilderness were actively used and fully inhabited by Indigenous Americans, to suggest that the designation of these lands as wilderness caused these displacements seems inaccurate and anachronistic. The word wilderness used then in these writings in the 1800s and the congressionally designated wilderness we have now is not the same thing. And if you don't make this distinction, it adds to the confusion surrounding the wilderness debate by conflating the history of the national parks movement with the history of wilderness designation. It's easy to just glance over this distinction, but please don't, because this implies the dualistic, backward-looking, purity-based understanding of wilderness that informed the establishment of the first national parks in the late 19th and early 20th century, with the same understanding of wilderness that guided the creation of the wilderness preservation system during the middle of the 20th century. The two are separate. The national parks movement followed on the heels of the Indian Wars, as is quoted in this publication. But the Wilderness Act did not. Let's look at an example. What am I getting at? What am I trying to explain here? Okay, so In Montana, for example, the Confederated Salish, Kootenai, and Penobscot tribes were forcibly removed from the Bitterroot Valley in the 1850s so that land could be opened for white farmers and ranchers. Some 100 years later, Congress created the Selway Bitterroot Wilderness in the mountains to the west of the Bitterroot Valley. It is unfortunate that the tribes were removed off this land in the Bitterroot Valley. It is incredibly and inexplicably terrible, but it happened 100 years before wilderness designation. Wilderness designation didn't cause it. Let's look at another example. The Shoshone-Bannocks once roamed throughout and among the Middle Fork of the Salmon River drainage, and they were forcibly removed during the what is called the Sheep Eater Wars of 1879 for gold, under the false pretense of murdering Chinese miners and also stealing horses. So then the settlers and the gold miners moved in, and they found that gold was not in any great source. And then the river drainage remained mostly unoccupied and undisturbed for decades. The Middle Fork of the Salmon River runs through the heart of the ancestral homelands of the Shoshone-Bannock tribes and the Nez Perce, and it also runs through the heart of the 2.5 million acre Frank Church Wilderness, which was designated in 1980. So wilderness legislation and administration and visitation in the later half of the 20th century reflects a much more relativistic and forward-looking conception of wilderness, one for which the question of prior human inhabitation, use, and modification by either Native Americans or non-natives does not present any inherent challenges. So let me offer another piece of history. In the drafts of the Wilderness Bill, there was originally a section that stated that lands on Indian reservations could be included in the National Wilderness Preservation System with the consent of the tribes. This section was taken out of the Wilderness Bill and never made it into the Wilderness Act because the tribes did not want their lands included in the National Wilderness Preservation System. So that was removed. It was removed from future drafts of the bill. In 1979, the Confederated Salish and Kootenai Tribal Council informally established a tribal wilderness. And then in 1982, the council passed Ordinance 79A, which established the Mission Mountains Tribal Wilderness. And in this statement from their Tribal Wilderness Ordinance, they explained that wilderness has played an important role for the tribes and that maintaining an enduring resource of wilderness is vitally important to the tribes and for the perpetuation of their culture. And this might look familiar. This is the tribal definition of wilderness that the Tribal Council has stated in their Ordinance 79A. This is the definition that they chose. Again, there are critics that would like to say that the word untrammeled eclipses indigenous homelands and human presence, and that the Wilderness Act definition intimates a sense of purity and a cleansing of the land. And on this slide, I present the definition of tribal wilderness adopted by the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes when they designated their tribal Mission Mountain Tribal Wilderness. And you can see that it says it's an area where the earth and its community of life are untrammeled by man, where man himself is a visitor who does not remain. And it goes on to say, without permanent improvements or human habitation. And at the end, again, it looks very familiar, devoted to the purposes of recreational, scenic, scientific, educational, conservation, cultural, religious, and historical use. Last year, the Southern Utah Wilderness Alliance proposed designation of 8 million acres of wilderness in the American Red Rock Wilderness Act. And the Navajo Reservation borders many of these public lands that were proposed for wilderness designation. And the lands in the America's Red Rock Wilderness Act have some critical cultural and historical importance to the Navajo, and therefore the tribe has supported the wilderness designation. The tribe also notes that wilderness designation will preserve the cultural art, the cliff dwellings, and other historic and prehistoric and culturally significant sites of all previous people who inhabited the area. So this is a quote from the Navajo Council. It states, management of wilderness is one of the strongest and most protective designations available to public lands. And I'm going to wrap up with just a few more slides here. If you haven't read this article, I highly recommend it. There's also a webinar recording that's available on the National Park Service's YouTube channel. It's a webinar on this article with all three authors. And I'd like to quote one of the authors here. The quote states, "It is true that early indigenous people had no conception of wilderness, but neither did Western people before they were exposed to the environmental degradations that led to development of the wilderness ethic. We should remember that the wilderness idea evolved and continues to evolve, as do all concepts of environmental ethics, in response to new understandings and changes in society and its relationship to the environment." One of the authors from this article is Polly Napurik Andrews, and she is Cupik. She's a tribal member and a training specialist at the Southern Central Native Foundation in Alaska. And I'm going to just quickly read a few quotes from her. She stated in this article, "It is true that my Cupik ancestors had no word for wilderness, nor did we have words for airplanes, computers, or the internet, or for climate change, endangered species, or biodiversity either. But we've adopted these words and concepts for the modern, altered, and changing world we now live in. Yes, there are differences between our traditional worldviews and the wilderness concept, but too often we focused too much on differences." The third author is Bernadette Dementioff, and she is the executive director of the Gwich'in Steering Committee and a council member for the Arctic Refuge Defense Council. And in the article, I will read this: "We advocate for wilderness because it will provide the strongest protection for our birthing grounds of the porcupine caribou herd." She goes on to state, "Wilderness recognizes our way of relating to the land and the earth. The wilderness idea that humans are part of a larger community of life and should act like it has been known to my people for millennia." I mentioned a few slides ago the Shoshone Bannock, who lived in the Middle Fork of the Salmon, and the people were removed in what were called the Sheep Eater Wars of 1879. So River Nua is a indigenous organization to reconnect tribal members to their ancestral lands. And I'm just gonna play a really short clip. This is called River of Return. So let me just play a few seconds of this.
The Middle Fork is really ideal for these trips. There's no fences, there's no roads, there's very little to any fragmentation or disconnection of habitat. And I didn't see this growing up. A lot of the adults here on the reservation haven't seen it. A lot of the youth haven't seen it. My wife didn't see the Middle Fork until she was adult. And so I think what we're offering isn't just a free trip on the river, but actually a great opportunity to reconnect to a really special place to us.
And if you'd like to watch that movie, it's available on YouTube. It's called River of Return. I wanted to wrap this up by explaining why this historical tour was important. This slide is from an article titled Legislative Interpretation as a Guiding Tool for Wilderness Management by Shannon Meyer. And as we walked through this presentation, I presented the legislative history and other historical documents. And this slide suggests why that is appropriate, namely items 1 and 5 on this list. First, in the future, I want to avoid any absurd results. And second, I want to help us all as wilderness managers, users, and lovers to choose the most reasonable interpretation in what can be or is suggested to be a controversial law. We have the tools for resolving such conflicts, and one is the legislative interpretation. Just a brief review of what we've looked at. The idea of wilderness has been topic of ongoing debate. There's been criticism for decades. And one criticism was that wilderness perpetuates the dichotomy between humans and nature, especially the phrase untrammeled by man. I presented historical documents, the phrase that are closer to the intention of the Wilderness Act authors, suggesting that man is a member of the natural community. Next, we looked at the purity definition of wilderness and where that came from. And I want to point out again that it was the people that opposed wilderness designation, not wilderness advocates, that really pushed this purity definition of wilderness. And then finally, the criticism that wilderness promotes a colonialist mindset. And again, we saw that earlier drafts of the Act did not suggest pristine wilderness. They did not construct it in a way that excluded human touch, and that a lot of tribes are now supporting wilderness designation. Okay, so that's all the time we currently have. I hope this plants a seed of curiosity. I hope that before assuming negative intentions of the authors of the Act, that you consider looking at the Act through historical lens, that you dive deeper into the historical documents, and that you continue to find ways to include diverse views in wilderness in a positive way. As you work to make your wilderness work and your wilderness interp more inclusive, that does not mean we have to create alternative interpretations of the Act. We have the tools to look at historical documents and interpret it in a way that aligns with the intentions of the authors of the Act. So instead of focusing on differences and causing unnecessary and unhealthy strife or angst, let's focus on the commonalities. Instead of building bridges that can connect us, this unfounded criticism unnecessarily divides us. And that's all I have.
Super, thanks, Michelle.